If you look at who holds the stock, 72% of all stock in the United States is held by pension plans. So who's going to get hurt? People who are on pensions. They're going to have their wealth snatched away from them if you increase the capital gains tax. That's where the thing hits. And by the way, you said the proposal is to jack the headline rate up to 44% in the United States. On an inflation-adjusted basis, it's already that high in the United States. So by making the statutory rate go up even higher than it is at present, it'll punch that rate, inflation-adjusted, even up higher than it already is. So it's a bad idea in both places. It hurts pensioners. It hits pensioners very hard. The total amount of revenue taken in by these capital gains taxes is not that great in terms of the total magnitude of taxes that are taken in. So the only way it kind of could indirectly, theoretically affect inflation is if it somehow generated more revenue, which by the way, that's very questionable, whether raising the rate actually would increase the revenue. But let's just assume the hypothetical that somehow it would magically raise the rate and that would increase the amount of revenue coming in. Well, that revenue is kind of a drop in the bucket, whatever it would be, and that wouldn't really affect the federal deficit that much, and that's where the inflation rub comes. If somehow you reduce the deficit, there's less pressure on the Federal Reserve to impose an inflation tax and basically inflate the debt burden away. So it would be a very questionable. It's all questionable. I would say off the top of my head, you can forget the inflation argument. It's not going to make much difference one way or another. If you want a healthy economy, is to bring down government spending. Government spending has been the killer in this, or in the United States. That is the main source of the increased and sustained deficit that we are witnessing in the United States and the record level of debt to GDP. And by the way, by reducing government expenditures, you kill two birds with one stone. You not only reduce the deficit or eliminate the deficit, but also you eliminate the crowding out of the private sector by the public sector. It's government spending that does the crowding out. I'm against waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's what accompanies the increased government spending. And the increased government spending, I want a larger private sector, not a larger government sector. And if a larger government sector is just going to reduce productivity, reduce growth, reduce prosperity in general, reduce people's real income. I'm for having a higher real income per capita. And you get that by what? Innovation and entrepreneurship in the private sector. You don't get it in the public sector. Why do you think Europe is on its knees almost? Their projected growth next year in Europe is in aggregate less than 1% on average in the European Union. Why is that? Because you have these huge government monsters where, like France, the king is spending 56% of GDP in government spending. All of the European countries have much higher levels of government spending relative to GDP than in the United States, and they grow more slowly. And I don't think that's good. That's bad. I want incomes to grow fast, not slowly. You know, the rich are paying a disproportionate share of the taxes already. So, you know, that's an income distribution kind of argument, not necessarily a growth kind of argument. And what happens when you tax people more? They definitely work less, and they save less, and they invest less, and all that's bad for the economy. Plus, they move around. Those in states where they have high progressive personal income tax rates do what? Well, they move out of those states. They move to places like Florida or Nevada or Texas. So people aren't just static. It's basically supply and demand. Just look at the United States. Look at the states that are taxing heavily. California, people are moving out. New York, people are moving out. And where do they go? They go to places where they have low tax rates. Florida, Texas, Nevada. if you tax, people don't save as much and they don't invest as much. And if you invest less and are putting less capital into the system, your productivity is going down. Remember, I was on Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, and Reaganomics and supply side economics, we went through all of this stuff in the early 80s. We'd reached in the 70s a point where we had, remember something called stagflation? That's what we had in the 70s. And what happened? Reagan came in with Reaganomics and slashed personal income tax rates, corporate income tax, capital gains taxes, and the economy started mending itself. And by the time we got in, particularly to the 90s, the real beneficiary of the thing happened to be President Clinton. A lot of these benefits came from the reforms and taxes that were done in the 80s, the lowering of all these tax rates. And boom, we had a great decade in the 1990s. And by the way, Clinton, among other things, Clinton wasn't raising taxes. He was doing reforms. You had Clinton, the last 2 years he was in office, actually producing surpluses. There weren't deficits in the United States. We weren't talking about a deficit problem. Everyone was wringing their hands. They said, oh, the government's not going to be issuing any bonds anymore. The bond market's going to dry up because Clinton's running surpluses. And it was a combination. You had Clinton in the White House, and you had Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House. You had two smart politicians involved in the thing. And what happened? You had a booming economy. You had Alan Greenspan was at the Fed. So you had a real boom in the 1990s. Plus the fact we weren't engaged in new wars like now. Biden has we've been drug into 2 wars, and we're financing those. Clinton was benefiting from the peace dividend. Remember, the Soviet Union collapsed. We had a huge peace dividend that was the big beneficiary politically, and that was President Clinton. But in fact, he left this supply side economics regime and overlay in place, and you had pretty much good monetary stability with Alan Greenspan. He was following Hanke's golden growth rate rule for the Fed. The money supply was, growing at a pretty steady rate around 6%, a rate consistent with hitting an inflation target of 2%. So at any rate, we've been through this before, and the evidence of how bad these ideas are, look at the 1970s and the trouble we got into in the 1970s. All these tax increases eventually produced what? Stagflation. If you look at what's happened over the last year, it's negative. I mean, it's contracted. The money supply is much less than it was a year ago. And when you have these contractions, which are very unusual, by the way, we've only had 4 contractions in the U.S. history, I should say, in the history of the Federal Reserve since 1913. And each one of those contractions did exactly what the quantity theory of money would predict. We had a recession. So that's why getting into the quantity theory of money, if the money supply, the fuel for the economy contracts and it is negative on a sustained basis, which it has been, you ultimately are going to get a recession, and it's baked in the cake. The problem is, when will this occur? And just to clarify on this, remember some time ago, John Greenwood and I actually initially, once this negativity crept into the system, we thought that the recession would hit much earlier than it's going to hit. We thought that it would hit by the end of 2023. Well, we know it didn't hit. We're already past that date. And now we think that late in 2024 or early 2025, it's going to hit. Right. It'll work its way through the system and eventually hit. That's why I use this expression, it's baked in the cake, because you get a big change in the money supply, and there's a long and variable lag between that change in the money supply and when the economic activity starts changing. And the reason we were off on our initial forecast was because we built up such a huge excess of cash balances in the economy. And what is that? You can calculate it. Go to the St. Louis Fed statistical thing, and you take M2 and just divide GDP and M2, and that's the cash balance. And that thing went way, way, way up. And now that's all drained off. The excess cash balance now is all drained off. John and I thought it would be drained off much faster than it actually has than we've witnessed. That's the story on why we were off. But in general, people have to remember, money dominates. The quantity theory of money is the correct way to look at what's going to happen with the course of the economy and inflation. Now, what's the quantity theory of money? It just means that big changes in the money supply move things. And if you have a boom in the money supply like we did after COVID, and when it peaked out in February of 2022 at 27% year-over-year growth, we've never had that before. That's the highest rate we've ever had in the United States since 1913 when the Fed was installed. And what did we get? We got a lot of inflation. Now, Greenwood and I predicted that exactly. Remember, we said it would go up maybe as high as 9%. Well, it did go up to 9.1%. So we got that right. What we didn't get right is this business about the contraction. It started contracting, and we know eventually we'll get contraction in the economy. We'll also get contraction in inflation. So the viewer said 2% by the end of this year. It might take a little longer to get 2% because we've had 3 months of basically stable inflation. It hasn't continued on a linear path. The questioner said, I think he had some phrase in there about nonlinearity, and he's correct. Things don't always move in a straight line.